The chamber is quiet in a way only palaces can manage. Thick stone walls swallow sound, leaving only the soft rustle of fabric and the faint crackle of candle flames. At the center of the room stands a woman whose crown has already been removed. She is not dragged, she is not restrained. She is addressed politely, spoken to in careful tones, as though etiquette itself might soften what is about to happen. Servants step forward carrying folded lengths of cloth.
The first layer is silk, cool and smooth against the skin. It is wrapped carefully around her arms, then her torso, the fabric pulled snug but not yet tight. The queen's breath remains steady, though her chest rises a fraction quicker than before. No one meets her eyes. They are trained professionals, taught not to hesitate, not to comfort, not to speak. Silence is part of the ritual. This is not an execution. It is a preparation.
Across many cultures and centuries, certain queens were not killed by blade, poison, or public decree. They were wrapped, layer by layer. Cloth replacing chains, ceremony replacing spectacle. To the outside world, it looked dignified, almost merciful. But dignity, in these chambers, was simply another form of control. Royal blood carried, meaning beyond the body that contained it. To spill it publicly was considered dangerous, politically, spiritually, symbolically. Blood belonged to the crown as much as the crown belonged to the bloodline. A queen's death had to preserve the illusion of divine order, even as it quietly erased her from history. Wrapping achieved that balance perfectly. As the cloth tightens around her shoulders, the symbolism becomes clearer. Queens were not treated as criminals. They were treated as sacred objects that had become inconvenient. You do not destroy sacred objects in public. You remove them discreetly, respectfully, without disturbing belief. Another layer is added, this one thicker. Linen, pressed firmly around her ribs. Her breathing grows shallow. Not enough to alarm anyone, but enough to be noticed. The servants adjust their grip, tightening with careful precision. This is practiced work. This has been done before. The contrast is intentional. Everything about the setting suggests reverence. Incense drifting through the air. Prayals whispered softly. The glow of gold fixtures reflecting off polished stone. And yet the act itself is irreversible. The cloth is not meant to warm her. It is meant to silence her, to contain movement, to restrict breath, to end a life without acknowledging that a life is being taken. Queens who faced this fate were often accused of crimes that could not be proven in open court. Treason whispered behind tapestries. Infertility framed as divine failure. Political inconvenience disguised as moral weakness. Executing them publicly would invite sympathy, unrest, questions. Wrapping them avoided all of that. No blood, no screams, no visible violence. Just absence. The cloth moves upward now, drawn carefully around her neck, stopping just short of her jaw. Her hands remain free, for the moment. This is not cruelty born of anger. It is cruelty born of calculation. Every detail serves a purpose. Even the order of wrapping matters. This is how power eliminates itself without appearing violent. What makes this ritual especially chilling is how it reframes death. The queen is not punished. She is managed. Her body becomes a problem to be solved quietly. The same court that once bowed to her now watches without emotion as she is reduced to a shape beneath fabric. Her voice, her authority, her presence, all contained by cloth, chosen for its softness. This is why wrapping endured as a method. It preserved appearances. It allowed successes to claim continuity, not rupture. The queen did not die violently. She passed. She fell ill. She was retired from history. The truth remains sealed inside layers of silk and linen. As the final wraps are secured, her breathing becomes shallow enough to hear. Each breath, shorter than the last. The candles flicker as if aware of what is happening. No one ruses, no one comforts. The ritual does not end until stillness arrives on its own. Queens were not executed because execution acknowledges guilt. Wrapping acknowledged nothing. It erased quietly, respectfully, efficiently, and to understand why power preferred cloth to steel, silence to spectacle. We must examine what royal blood meant and why it could never be allowed to spill. To understand why queens were wrapped instead of executed, we must examine what royal blood meant and why it could not be shed. For much of history, royal blood was believed to exist on a different plane than ordinary flesh. It was not merely biological, it was symbolic, sacred, and dangerously powerful. Kings and queens ruled not only through force, but through the belief that their bodies were vessels of divine order. To spill royal blood openly was to risk more than scandal. It threatened the legitimacy of the throne itself. That belief shaped how queens were allowed to die. Across empires, blood carried meaning. It bound dynasties, justified succession, and linked rulers to gods. In medieval Europe, monarchs were anointed with holy oil, their bodies marked as chosen by divine will. In Persia and Byzantium, royal blood was thought to contain cosmic authority. To draw it publicly was to invite curses, rebellion, and divine retribution. Even executioners hesitated when faced with a crowned body. Violence against royalty had to be invisible. Rapine solved that problem. By suffocating or constricting a queen beneath layers of cloth, power could remove her without staining the ground or alarming the people. No blade struck. No blood flowed. The ritual preserved the illusion that the monarchy remained pure and uninterrupted. A queen could disappear without disrupting the myth that sustained the throne. The method also protected those who ordered it. Councils, priests, regents, and rival heirs could claim distance from the act itself. They did not kill her. They merely sanctioned a ritual. Responsibility dissolved into procedure. Servants rapped, priests prayed. Authority observed. No single hand carried the guilt. The crimes that led queens to this fate were rarely crimes in the modern sense. More often, they were political liabilities, disguised as moral failures. A queen who could not produce an heir threatened dynastic continuity. One suspected of infidelity endangered bloodlines. Others were accused of treason not for action, but for influence alliances, loyalties, whispered support for rivals. Public trials risked exposure. Rapping avoided explanation. Religion played a critical role in legitimizing this practice. Cloth already held sacred meaning. Burial shrouds symbolized transition from earthly life to divine judgment. Monastic vows involved ritual clothing that separated the holy from the profane. By wrapping a queen, the act could be framed as preparation for spiritual passage rather than execution. Death was presented as inevitable, almost natural, rather than imposed. The silence of the ritual mattered as much as the method. Queens were often isolated from public view before being wrapped, removed from court under pretexts of illness or retreat. When death came, it arrived without witnesses. No cries echoed through halls. No bloodied garments circulated as proof. The absence of spectacle prevented outrage. Silence preserved stability. Historical records hint at how widespread this practice was. Byzantine chronicles describe empresses smothered beneath cushions and cloth to avoid spilling blood. Persian accounts mention royal women wrapped tightly and left until breath ceased. In medieval Europe, queens accused of treason were sometimes confined until death, their passing recorded without detail. The consistency across cultures suggests shared logic rather than coincidence. The contrast between royal and common death could not have been clearer. A peasant was executed publicly, his blood serving as warning. A queen was erased discreetly, her death sanitized for political consumption. One reinforced fear, the other preserved belief. Both served power. Wrapping also stripped queens of their final dignity. Though framed as respectful, the ritual denied them agency, even in death. They did not choose how to die. They did not face accusers. They were reduced to bodies to be managed, symbols to be neutralized. Cloth became a boundary between the living world and the truth. What made the practice endure was its effectiveness. It prevented martyrdom. It avoided rebellion. It allowed successors to rule without confronting the violence that secured their position. History recorded smooth transitions, not suffocations. Dynasties survived by hiding the cost of their continuity, but belief alone does not capture the horror of the ritual. To understand its full weight, one must step into the chamber itself to witness how silence, fabric, and obedience combined to end a life without ever acknowledging that death had occurred. But belief alone does not explain the method. To understand the horror, we must witness how the ritual unfolded. The chamber was chosen carefully. Thick walls, narrow entrances. A place where sound is all before it could travel. This was not where laws were proclaimed or alliances forged. This was where problems were removed. When the queen was led inside, the doors closed without ceremony. No guards stood at attention. No court officials bore witness. The fewer eyes that saw the ritual, the easier it would be to forget. Servants moved with practiced calm. They did not rush. Rushing suggested urgency, and urgency implied doubt. Instead, they worked slowly, deliberately, as if performing a familiar task that required precision rather than emotion. Cloth lay folded on a nearby table. Silk, linen, sometimes waxed fabric, chosen not for beauty, but for control. Each material served a purpose. The queen was positioned upright, often seated or standing against a solid surface. She was not restrained at first. That too was intentional. Resistance complicated the process. The ritual depended on compliance, or at least the appearance of it. Her expression was watched closely. Panic would be inconvenient. Silence was preferred. The first layer was always the softest. Silk slid around her arms and torso, cooled against the skin. It felt almost gentle, disarming. This was not how executions were supposed to feel. The cloth tightened gradually, enough to limit movement without alarming the breath. The servants adjusted their grip with subtle efficiency, pulling, smoothing, folding. Their hands never trembled. As more layers were added, the illusion faded. Linen followed, pressed more firmly around her ribs. Her chest rose less freely now. Breathing required effort. The room seemed to grow smaller, air thicker, sound muted. The queen's awareness sharpened. She understood the purpose at last. This was not preparation for burial. This was the method itself. Her arms were bound closer to her body, pinned by fabric rather than rope. Movement became restricted, then impossible. Cloth wrapped across her shoulders, donor bach cinched at the waist. Each pass removed another degree of freedom. Still, no violence was visible. No marks appeared on the skin. To an observer, it might have looked ceremonial, even respectful. The final layers were applied with care. Sometimes the cloth crossed her mouth, muffling sound. Sometimes it stopped just below the chin, allowing breath to fail on its own. In some accounts, waxed fabric was used to ensure silence, pressed lightly but firmly until resistance faded. The method varied, but the goal remained constant. End her life without leaving evidence that it had been taken. Time became distorted. There was no sudden struggle, no dramatic collapse. The queen's breaths shortened gradually, each one shallower than the last. Panic flickered behind her eyes, then dulled. Her body fought quietly, muscles tightening beneath the cloth. But the fabric absorbed the motion, transforming struggle into stillness. Those present did not intervene. Intervention would have acknowledged what they were doing. Instead, they waited. Silence was essential. This was not a death meant to be remembered. It was a death meant to disappear into record books as illness, retreat, divine will. Historical accounts, when they exist at all, describe these moments obliquely. She was confined. She felt unwell. She passed quietly. The absence of detail is itself revealing. Chroniclers understood the boundaries of acceptable truth. The ritual depended on that understanding. In Byzantium, empresses were reportedly smothered with cushions and cloth to avoid shedding blood. Persian records describe royal women wrapped tightly and left alone until life faded. In medieval Europe, queens accused of treason vanished into chambers and emerged only as corpses prepared for burial. The consistency across cultures suggests a shared logic. Royal deaths must preserve the illusion of order. The symbolism was unmistakable. Cloth became coffin, womb, prison. The same material that once adorned her in ceremony now erased her. Silk that had signified status now enforced silence. Linen that symbolized purity now denied breath. Power did not need iron or steel. It used softness instead. What made the ritual especially devastating was its intimacy. The queen was not killed by an enemy in battle or by a masked executioner. She was ended by servants who had once dressed her, attendants who knew her habits, people trained to obey without question. Authority did not soil its hands. It delegated. When the room finally grew still, no announcement followed, no declaration of death. The servants waited until the body ceased responding, then began preparing it for burial. The cloth remained in place. It would be easier that way. The body was removed quietly, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Outside the chamber, life continued. Councils convened. Successors planned coronations. The court spoke of illness, of fate, of divine judgment. The truth remained sealed beneath layers of fabric, locked inside a room designed to forget. And yet, despite the silence, the ritual left a mark, not on the body, but on the system that relied on it. A system that understood something fundamental about power, that the quiet removal of a queen was far more effective than a public execution. But if silence was so powerful, why did the practice endure for so long? And what did it teach those who watched from behind closed doors? But if this method was so discreet, why was it remembered and why did it endure? The practice of wrapping queens before death endured because it achieved what open execution never could. It removed a rival without creating a martyr. It ended a life without disturbing belief. In societies where monarchy depended on divine illusion, silence was safer than spectacle. A beheading invited outrage. A disappearance preserved order. Power learned quickly that the quietest deaths were the most effective. From the perspective of the court, this method solved multiple problems at once. It avoided public bloodshed, which could stain the legitimacy of the crown. It prevented sympathy from forming among the people, and it allowed successors to claim continuity rather than rupture. The queen had not been punished, they said. She had simply faded from history. That ambiguity protected everyone involved. Silence also disciplined those who remained. Courtiers learned that influence could be fatal even without visible rebellion. Queens understood that status offered no immunity once usefulness ended. Servants learned to obey without asking what their obedience accomplished. The ritual trained an entire system in complicity. No one needed to speak about what happened, because speaking itself was dangerous. Over time, the deaths of wrapped queens transformed into myths. Chroniclers' soft language. Pain vanished from records. What remained were phrases like confined, removed, or taken ill. Absence replaced violence. This rewriting was intentional. By erasing detail, history protected power from scrutiny. The fewer questions asked, the stronger the illusion became. The psychological effect reached far beyond the chamber. Successors ruled knowing what awaited them if they failed. Marriages became more strategic, fertility more pressured, obedience more performative. Queens learned to measure every word, every alliance, every silence. The cloth that ended one life shaped the behavior of many others. Fear did not need to be visible to be effective. It only needed precedent. Eventually, the practice declined. Political systems shifted. Public executions replaced secret ones, as states sought to display authority openly rather than cloak it in myth. Legal reforms demanded documentation. Religious interpretations evolved, reframing divine authority away from royal bloodlines. As courts became more bureaucratic, quiet suffocation lost its utility. Power found new ways to eliminate rivals. Yet, the logic behind the ritual never disappeared. It simply adapted. Modern systems still prefer quiet removals to dramatic confrontations. Careers end through isolation rather than accusation. Influence fades through exclusion rather than trial. Silence remains one of authority's most reliable tools. The method has changed, but the instinct persists. What the wrapped queens reveal is not simply historical cruelty, but a deeper truth about power itself. Power does not always seek violence. Often, it seeks control over narrative. To decide how someone dies is significant. To decide how their death is remembered is absolute authority. By choosing silence, empires shaped memory itself. The cloth served many purposes at once. It preserved dignity while erasing agency. It honored royalty while destroying it. It allowed rulers to claim mercy while committing murder. And because it left no visible wound, It invited no immediate resistance. The absence of blood became the absence of outrage. Empires do not always kill their queens with swords. Sometimes they simply wrap them until history stops hearing them breathe. That quiet is not mercy. It is calculation refined into ritual, and that is why the practice endured. Not because it was humane, but because it worked. So the question that lingers is not confined to ancient courts or vanished dynasties. It reaches into every system that values order over truth. When power chooses silence over justice, disappearance over accountability, who decides which lives are allowed to fade quietly? And when history grows quiet around those disappearances, are we witnessing peace or just another room designed to forget?